very warm welcome from my side for the monthly lecture with Ranabir Samarat this evening. I'm Aisha Chalar. I am a permanent fellow here since beginning of October. And I'm a permanent fellow, but also additionally that I work at the University of Vienna Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, although I'm both sociologist and anthropologist. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome Ranabir Samarat. Ranabir is a known face to some of you here at IWM, and definitely a very well-known scholar for those of you who have been working on migration, on statelessness, on urban dynamics, on labor. Ranabir Samaddar is currently the Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies, Calcutta Research Group, since 2015. But between 2003 and 2015, he was the director of the Calcutta Research Group. And before that, he was the director of Peace Studies Program, South Asia Forum for Human Rights. Ranabir Samaddar had held several fellowships, visiting professorships, and served in numerous advisory boards and editorial boards of institution programs and journals. I'm not going to enumerate all these, then we will have no time to listen Ranabir. Ranabir is one of the critical scholars in the field of migration and forced migration studies, and his research focuses on is a very broad spectrum. His research profile covers a very broad spectrum on nation state, migration, as I said, but labor and urbanization. And he's the author, co-author, editor, co-editor of several books. Again, I will just name a couple of them. Memory, Identity, Power, Politics in Jungla Mahals, in 1998. The Marginal Nation, Transborder Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal. And he has co-authored the book Beyond Calcutta, Rajarhat and Dystopia of Urban Imagination. His most recent books are Karl Marx and the Postcolonial Age, and actually in January we had a talk by Ranabir on Marx and colonialism. And in 2016, he had published a book, Postcolonial Inquiry into Europe's Debt and Migration Crisis. His work also focuses on, of course, then on India, ideas and frameworks of governing India, passive revolution in West Bengal, and a co-edited volume on Rohingya in South Asia, people without a state, which is, this came out in 2018. And again in 2018, Migrants and the Neoliberal City. I said that his work focuses on practices, histories, and challenges of migration. One pillar of Ranabir's work is migrant labor and the neoliberal city. So he had worked on the relationship between labor and urban space, and it is very important that very often that the migrants as labor it has always been there, and it came back, but there was a while that the migrants as labor were forgotten. So he looks at the relationship between migrant labor, between labor and urban space, and he looks at the neoliberal city as encapsulating the contradictions of capitalism, and there that the migrant labor is very internal to those dynamics, but also cities as sites of contentious politics, is sites, especially the neoliberal city. It is a contentious place marked by groups of people fighting for rights, resources, claims, and justice. And the questions about governing the migrant as an ambiguous figure in the city, which is intrinsic to the city making, is crucial. But the second pillar of Ranabir's work is that he looks at the present migration and migration literature and experience and the quote-unquote crisis in the light of historical experience and similarities in terms between what is happening in the early, in terms of the colonial and post-colonial period, and situating the today's migration flows, experiences, and background to that history. So I think this is very valuable, and it is important that situating Europe through that kind of a colonial and post-colonial reading of massive and mixed migration flows. And of course this opens the questions about the contemporary conditions of citizenship, victimhood, and migration flows to a different kind of perspective. And then his work on the power and responsibility on the margins and on statelessness is a thread that goes through Ranabir's work, and I think we are going to hear about that part of his work. So very welcome, and the floor is yours, Ranabir. Thank you. You don't need that.
Thank you for this very generous introduction, and it's kind of overstates my work. Now, this is, as you can see, this is on statelessness. The main purpose of my talk is to suggest that the way in which we look at citizenship, most of the time we are not realizing that the historical phase of citizenship is over or is going to be over. And citizenship as a very settled norm of democracy is something that is problematized by the global experiences of statelessness. In this case, I pick up the experiences of statelessness in South Asia, the part of the world where I live in. I take up one or two cases. There are several cases of statelessness in that region, but I take up one or two cases, one of India and the other simply because it is more well known and probably the largest and the most acute in dimension, the Rohingya crisis. But the purpose is to suggest a broader trend that can be evinced elsewhere. Now, by and large, what I'm also something that I should state at the beginning, that the 1954 Convention on Statelessness, by and large, places statelessness in the context of refugeehood. And originally, the idea was that to use the 1954 Convention of Statelessness as a protocol of the 1951 Convention on Refugees. In other words, statelessness was linked to, and I think justifiably linked to, the refugee question, which became very important for Europe after the Second World War, though we know that refugee flows in much greater dimensions. I mean, you cannot compare with what happened in terms of the refugee flows in the decolonized world in the wake of the independence of the countries to what happened after the Second World War. Simply put, the refugee flows in the post-colonial world or in the decolonized world were much greater in level, scale, etc. But on the other hand, 1954 Convention on Statelessness, as I said, quite justifiably, and put the entire idea of statelessness in the context of migration. Now, what I am going to argue with the examples, the two broad cases, first through the Rohingya case, but secondly picking up certain Indian instances also, that statelessness in most of the countries, particularly the post-colonial countries of the world, is emerging not after going outside the state, but within the state. And before the person has taken a move, has left the country, the person is already in a situation of what international law would say as de facto stateless. There is a difference between de jure and de facto in this sense that the 54 Convention gives a de jure, what is de jure stateless, gives a definition of that, and by and large it says that a person who would have no state to look after to, that's Article 1.1, no nationality to claim, will be considered as stateless. But as you can see that, and as it is explained in the 54 Convention, which lays emphasis on extending all kinds of protection measures as possible and was imaginable in around that time to those who would be considered as stateless. But it depended on states acknowledging or states saying that this particular individual or group of individuals has not got any kind of protection from recognition as being a national of that particular country. The 1961 Convention on Reducing Statelessness realized by the time that this definition was inadequate or was not enough in terms of addressing the complexities of statelessness, and therefore dealt with questions of birth, death, marriage, etc., through which statelessness may occur, and therefore the reduction of statelessness, this convention focused on how to reduce statelessness by addressing these kinds of questions which acquire significance when a state decides to grant citizenship. Now, my own argument has been that both of these approaches address very little the concerns about citizenship and about the status of persons who are victims of forced migration in the post-colonial world. And to a quite substantial extent, to some parts of Africa, Eastern Europe, particularly after desovietization, in Central Asia, but I will not get into the other countries, but will stick to the India. Indian or the South Asian experiences. There is one more introductory comment, which is that why is it the case that statelessness is not being produced or produced less when a person becomes a refugee and is in what is technically called protracted state of displacement? UNHCR would always say that 5 years would be the period beyond which, if you are in a state of displacement, then you would be considered as a victim of a protracted state of displacement, which would mean that you are almost being deprived of any chance of return, voluntary return. And your chances of gaining back your abilities, economic ability, political ability, physical ability, emotional ability, to regain your status in life, again status as a political person, as a citizen, as a right-wielding person, as a claim-making agent, these will be significantly reduced. And the idea was that, so if you are a refugee, then your chances of becoming a stateless is more. But the case of Rohingyas and the other cases show that even before you are a refugee, within your own country, you can become stateless, which is the classic case of the Rohingyas. How did this situation come about? And that is something that I am going to tell today. And what it means, I shall end with reflecting on what it means in terms of our theories of citizenship, our understanding of subjectivity, and our understanding of how the global norms of protection work in terms of humanitarian ideology or in terms of human rights argument. This reflection is important precisely because globally we are seeing that there is a trend in almost all the democracies of achieving what one can call the right size of a territory with the right mix of a population. Nations, as we know, always want to have the right size. What is right size? There is no given right size, but those who have studied histories of borders, histories of nation states, they know that nation states have always tried to achieve what the nation state would consider to be the right size of it. It could be that the border should be extending up to a mountain range, it can be up to a river, it can be up to the extent of a population group settlement. It can be up to a point where a smaller neighbor or a irritant neighbor or a quarrelsome neighbor would not be able to do damage to the nation. It can be any of these factors but by and large, the tendency would be to gain the right size. You can hear in the Brexit debate the whole discussion about backstop. There is a very fascinating article which came out in the London Review of Books on the perennial tendency of the nation to achieve the kind of the right size. And on the other hand, this right size is not enough until and unless you have combined with it what you may call, political demographers are calling, the right mix of population. What is the mix? It's like building a house. What is the mix of material that you need? You cannot avoid the mix, but the right mix. And in order to achieve this perfect fit between the right size and the right mix, it can be shown, it can be argued that citizenship policies have undergone a great amount of churning. Now, I go into the material, but I just want to show you 3 or 4, photographs so that you get an idea. Can you kindly? Yeah. No, the first one, I think, no, this is the last one. There are 7 photographs. Is it there with you?
This is the first one, and the second.
Okay. Yeah, and then I think there should be one more. Yes. Now you can see this is basically the area. So the Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh, India, and that's precisely the area where the Rohingyas have been living for, let's say, certainly last 200 years, but it's recorded that Muslims from India, before that Chettiar people from Tamil Nadu, they also went there around 1100, 1200 AD. So it's a long history. The next one. This shows, but it's all jumbled up now, but in any case, this shows actually how the Rohingyas fled and what are the sea routes of the Rohingyas after they took to the seas, because quite an amount of the material that I intended to present deals with taking to the seas and comparing it with the Mediterranean. You know, the Mediterranean journey of the North African. What happened? I don't know. Oh.
I don't know why it keeps switching.
And the next one? Yes. This. Yeah, these are the. Leave it. Forget. There were 7 slides. Okay. Now this you saw, these are the important areas, but I wanted to show something else. Can you? Yeah. This is basically the Rakhine state, and the Rakhine state was formed in 1950 after decolonization. And I was going to tell you very briefly the history of the Rakhine state, and this is the capital of the Rakhine state, which is now a site of competition between China and India. Both are trying to court the rulers of Myanmar. One wants to set up a free trade zone, a shipping terminal. The other ones, India wants to use it as one of the important points in terms of India's lookist and actist policy, a fast economic corridor. Is there any other? There were 3 more. Yeah. These are the main ethnic groups. You can see the Rohingyas here. Now, Rohingyas and Rakhine, the distinction is very difficult to make. It's overlapping. But what the Myanmarese government, they want to say is that the Rohingyas are Muslims who came from India, particularly from Bangladesh, whereas Rakhines, it could be called, they're the Buddhists. Some of them are Muslims, but they are Burmese Muslims. Now, how they differentiate between who is an Indian Muslim and Burmese Muslim after 100 years is a problem that has emerged in the Indian case in Assam also. And these are the other, what you might call ethnic groups in Myanmar. And then there should be one more. Yes, these are slightly overstated, you know, the figures, but you can get a rough idea of how the Rohingyas have spread through the world after escaping. So the amount of, or the range of Rohingya flows, the dimension is really huge. Almost an entire population had to leave Myanmar. And there should be one more. Yeah, you can see the spread of the Rohingyas. Is there any other slide left? Okay. So, you know, it's very interesting that part of the reason, let it remain, that the British actually in the 18th century first brought in Indian laborers here. So in some sense, why I'm saying that there is a particular post-colonial take to the problem of statelessness, which is not addressed in the Convention on State, 1954 Convention, begins with this, and I will read out a very small paragraph which will show. In a fascinating essay on what the East India Company in the late 18th century as Arakanese refugees. In the East India Company documents, the phrase that is used is Arakanese refugees, and it's interesting, even at that time they were using the word refugees, which was not a legal word at all, who were settled by the company in the Chittagong and the western Burma area. A young historian, Anandarup Sen, brings to light the nature of the population flows in that region 2 centuries earlier. Sen focused on company's select plans of settlement, whose logic was a peculiar mix of military and economic considerations of viewing space from the point of ideas of usefulness and peculiarities of what the company also called refugee labor. and in this way brought to attention the always present particular historical rendition of the meanings associated with the term refugee, which combines notions of displaced, dispossessed, and what is important for my larger argument, the productive role of the refugee within the same analytic field. In arguing for what refugee labor implied in a land and time marked by intense war-making exercises, here we are speaking of 1890s, but please understand 1826 is the time when finally the British conquers Burma and the famous or infamous Yandabo Treaty between the independent rulers of Burma and the East India Company is concluded, whereby then the British gets the formal right to bring all the laborers and start British construction, agricultural production and all of those things there. Sen recalled the early travels of one of the very famous, how would you call it, very early ethnographers of India, Francis Buchannon, in early 19th century, who, after touring the lands of the provinces of Chittagong and Tipperary, and looking at the destitution of the different sections of the people, including the Arakanis, lodged in that region, concluded his essay with the following question. There is something else I want to gesture at here. It has to do with the word refugee. The term acquired particular resonances in a politics of modernity. What happens to a figure when it is located in the early etchings of colonial empire? Deracinated from the temporal provenance of the 20th century, how does one think of this category, 21st century? What did it mean to be a refugee in company-occupied Chittagong? Perhaps recognizing such questions will contribute to an understanding of how the category has historically been worked out, considering the growing number of Rohingya Muslims shuttling the waters of Bay of Bengal as refugees today. The significance of tracing these older roots of dispossession have only become sharper. Now, through the 19th century, we have instances of conflict between what was mentioned as the Rakhine and the Rohingyas, meaning the Buddhists. But again, one has to note that even the Buddhists of that area practiced a separate kind of Buddhism, which is usually called the Theravada, which is a kind of Hinayana Buddhism. And they had conflict with the central rulers of Burma today, which is called Myanmar, and East India Company also. So Arakan, meaning what is today the Rakhine state, had always this whole problem with the central rulers of the land. And while within Arakan the different ethnic groups had their own problems in the sense of coexisting, yet they had coexisted. There had been cases of intermarriage. There had been evidences of land transfers from one community to another. Keeping in mind that what is today known as the Rohingya always acted as labor, particularly construction labor, labor in the port, and labor in land, agricultural labor for all the landed communities. And it was only very rarely that the Rohingyas, but the term was not there. The term Rohingya comes only from Rohang, and it is only after 1950. So you do not find a Rohingya in that sense in any literature of that time. All you find, as the British put it, refugees from Chittagong or the displaced from Chittagong and other areas. The Anglo-Burmese War, as I said, with which the whole thing, formally ends with British domination established, which is 1826, the question became much more, acute there, because the British then started bringing in labor as well as inviting moneylenders and prosperous agricultural colonies to that area so that land could be reclaimed and British revenue increased, commerce increased, trade increased, port developed, etc. A number of minority ethnic groups in course of time settled in Rakhine, which means the Arakan today known as the Rakhine, including Chin, Khami, who are mostly Christians, Kamans in the coastal region, who largely converted to Islam, in addition to the Buddhist majority groups, as I said, that they had practiced the Hinayana Buddhism. There were perceived cultural and ethnic dissimilarities between the Buddhists and the Muslims, but these were perceived, it was not very clear, as I said, that there were a lot of economic interdependence between the two groups. Arakan, in any case, had also a set of very strong local rulers who were Buddhists and who had very proud cultural and political traditions, similar but certainly in a conflicted relation with the Burmans and the Shans in the other part of Myanmar. Think of the first census. Everyone knows, those who study history, anthropology, how census also plays a very important role in deciding finally who would become a citizen. It's a kind of 100 years of census operation that finally results in deciding, well, X would be considered as a citizen. In the first census of British Burma in 1872, Muslims were categorized as either Burman Muslims or Indian Muslims. So in 1872, you have Muslims, but Muslims between either you were a Burman Muslim or an Indian Muslim. And in the Arakans, 64,000 people were considered as Muslims, and out of the 2/3 of the total number of Muslims, they lived in Arakans. So out of the total Muslim population of Myanmar, 2/3 lived in that region. In 1891 census, which is in Burma, then the next important census, Muslims, the categories now changed, and the categories that were being used in Indian census operation were then used in the census operation there. So now you would not have anymore the Burman Muslim and the Indian Muslim. In place, you would have now Sheikhs, Saids, Mughals, Pathans and other groups, including Arakanis. And how they divided all those into all those groups, we do not have that clear history. But it doesn't stop there, because Sheikhs, Sayyids and all that, those differentiation between the Muslim community, you can get it in India. But what was added was, the British thought, again probably justifiably, that there were Burmese realities also that had to be included. So you had the Arakani Muslim, you had the Shan Muslim, Turk Muslim, Arab Muslim and all other Muslims. By 1921, you take the next leap. By the time they count, probably through this method, that 500,000 Muslims were there in a population of 13 million. And Muslims of Indian origin, they were not divided, so you cannot tell who was a Bengali Muslim or not, but it was only said that Muslims of Indian origin, which means that they could have come from different parts of India. But by and large, the Naf River, which is actually here, which is this part, the conflict between the Bengali population on this side, which is today's Bangladesh side, the Chittagong side, and the Rakhine population began. There were regular clashes between the two groups, but these were not so, in a way, so much provocative for the Burmese if the Chettiar moneylenders were not brought in huge number by the British rulers. And it is the money lending practices of the Chettiars which, we are told, antagonized the local people very much. And in some way you can say that on the basis of this historical material that the modern conflicts started to grow, which we saw finally after the Second World War, when the Burmese independence movement began in a big way, that as part of the Burmese independence, the Burma Independence Army in fact, large-scale attacks on Indians began, and as in many other cases, nationalism here also developed. on the basis of one of the demands being that Indians have to be expelled, which meant also the today's Rohingya labor, the poor agriculturists there. There are rough estimates about how many Indians died. It's said roughly between 15 to 20,000 Indians were killed. But by and large, we can say that 200,000 Muslims and another 200,000 non-Muslim Indians were expelled from Burma, that is today's Myanmar. By 1978, I'm just, as you can see, trying to shorten this period as much as possible. By 1978, the Burmese rulers decide to not only clean up the area militarily, but they combine a security operation with a special kind of census operation. The security operation being conducted on the ground that the Arakanis had developed by the time a militant group, and the Arakanese Communist Party had become very strong, which had by the time started demanding independence, then autonomy, and the Arakanese Communist Party, even though dominated by the Muslims, were not a religion-based army. It was as any communist army would be. So that was the ground on which, that was the reason or pretext, whatever you might say, the Burmese authorities decided to conduct a security operation, but it was then combined with a census operation, which would then decide who were the actual Burmese Muslims of that area. That was the military cum census operation of 1983-84, which resulted in the expulsion of 250,000 Rohingyas. The Rohingyas, if you ask when from, what is the cut-off date, we can say that Rohingyas cease having any nationality roughly from that time. The state kept on claiming that the Rohingya problem was one of unregistered illegal immigrants. It's the Bangladeshis or the Bengali Muslims who had gone there over the time, who had been brought in there by the British, and they did not belong to Myanmar. So the Rohingyas became a stateless population in 82 with the revised Myanmar citizenship law that excluded them from the list of 135 national ethnic groups. So the citizenship drive decided, it was conducted on the basis of the decision of the state that ethnic groups would be recognized and those ethnic groups will be given, people belonging to those ethnic groups would be given citizenship. There were 135 such acknowledged national ethnic groups, and Rohingyas were excluded from that, and Rohingyas were considered henceforth as non-state persons. They were not called stateless, but they were non-state. They did not belong to any nationality group recognized as Myanmaris by the Myanmarese state. And as then within Myanmar, as nationality issues got more ethnicized and securitized, there was an increase of de facto statelessness. Unfortunately, we have argued with the UNHCR that this is the weakness of what we claim as what we term as the Geneva-based wisdom, and we have not endeared ourselves with the international community because of our argument. But unfortunately, as I said, that both the conventions, the 54 convention and the 61 convention, they do not have any provision, any scope for acknowledging the problem of statelessness in the way in which it has grown in this case. It was the same case with India and Sri Lanka, with the difference that it were the Indian rulers and Sri Lankan rulers who agreed between themselves to solve the problem. Some of you may know that the British practice of taking the colonial labor to different countries as happened in the case of the Rohingyas, happened with case of the what is called the plantation labor in Sri Lanka, the upcountry labor. In that case also, labor in large number from 1860s onwards as plantation developed in Sri Lanka, mainly tea plantation, labor was taken from southern part of India. And after Sri Lanka got independence by 1956, summarily this huge number of people, close to 1 million, were disenfranchised, that you are not Sri Lankans, that you are Indians, go back. There were massive riots. Today Sri Lankan problem, even though focuses or is mainly around the Sri Lankan Tamil question, but again it began and it had entanglement with what is called the Indian origin Tamils, that's the plantation labor. And in this case, fortunately, both the Indian rulers and the Sri Lankan rulers saw merit in bilateral treaty. The reason for mentioning it, and I do not want to go into that because we don't have time, that almost in all cases it has been found that statelessness is not a problem of citizenship only confined to a state. It has always regional dimensions and ramifications. And wherever the problem of statelessness has been, at least to a certain extent, satisfactorily solved. Classic is the case of the ex-Yugoslavs. And colleagues here would have been better able to tell you that story. But then again, the case of Mauritania. Now, in cases where partly this has been solved, or at least to a certain extent satisfactorily solved, the region has played an enormously important role. In case of India, Sri Lanka also, the bilateral treaty mode was important. In certain African countries, this has happened. But in this case, Bangladesh said that they were not Bangladeshis, and Myanmar said they were not Myanmaris. And this was so in between, you have the more than 1 million people who had no place to go to or to look after. And as I said, that the thing became complicated, it perhaps could have been, at least partly solved if India and China had taken some initiative. But, and this is where the Rohingya part of the story, will end. For India, the lookist part and the act is, for India, the more important is that they want to construct a high-speed communication way so that trade can go up to Vietnam, Laos and Vietnam. And so therefore, this port becomes very important for them. And India's policy is that actually it has to escape Bangladesh, come here, and from here India will be helping Myanmar to construct a road so that India can reach its northeastern state of Mizoram. On the other hand, as you know, those who study China's Silk Route, China has this maritime Silk Route policy or strategy, and in maritime Silk Route, Sittwe is an extremely strategically important point. And without this, the maritime Silk Route cannot be conceived of, planned. And it is from Sittwe that Calcutta, Colombo, all other things, it's one of the really the pivot of in that area, the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal area, on which will depend the success of the maritime Silk Route. Now, this is in some sense a very, very brief story, but it is very clear. I mean, even this very brief description makes it clear that what was essentially a very local conflict now has all the elements set in place so that it becomes then one of a very transnationalized, globalized kind of conflict scenario, where on one hand you have statelessness, on the other hand two economic powers are vying for that same land, the Rakhine state, for free trade zone, for expansion of trade, for building up of this very modern and huge container terminal. But at the same time, while people are trying to acquire the land, it's exactly the Gadar port in Pakistan where you have the same kind of problems. The local people have been thrown out, and there is no reason why Rohingya should be occupying the small plots of land. So expelling Rohingyas, apart from having an ethnic rationale or a nationality rationale, there is also the economic rationale of clearing up the whole area of useless things, quote and unquote, and making it, fit for global trade and economic activities. Now, this is one of the, how would you put it, practice model through which statelessness is emerging. You can see it has very little to do with migration. Migration happens only later. The forced migration happens only after they had been declared stateless. Everything has been taken away and now they have to flee. So this happened in Mauritania for blacks in 1989, in Estonia for ethnic Russians after 1991, many ex-Yugoslavs in the 1990s. In South Asia, South Bhutanese in Bhutan in late 80s and 90s of the last century, and now the Rohingyas. In 2014, the UNHCR launched a campaign for reducing statelessness. When they asked us, and I was leading that inquiry into finding out the extent of statelessness in South Asia. And we studied 6 cases. One is, I mentioned the repatriation of the plantation labor from Sri Lanka to India. Second, what would happen to the South Bhutanese who were expelled from Bhutan again? They had been taken to Bhutan as labor after the 5-year plans started in Bhutan for developing Bhutan. The Chins from western part of Myanmar to India. Bihari Muslims who became stateless after Bangladesh was born, and the Rohingyas, and the Chinese of Calcutta. Now, after we presented our study to the UNHCR, the dispute with what we termed as the Geneva-based wisdom began. And please listen to this carefully, because I would have to be also very exact about exactly what the dispute was. UNHCR's argument was that you are confusing weak citizenship status with de facto statelessness. In other words, what you are saying is a condition of de facto statelessness is not a situation of de facto statelessness, but it is a situation of weak citizenship. So that Rohingyas were being expelled or Rohingyas were fleeing were because of the weakness in the citizenship structure of Myanmar. And it had not anything to do with statelessness, because statelessness, as I said, according to Article 1.1 of the 54 Convention, where statelessness is defined, will be when all states have said, this is an individual, this is a group, we have nothing to do with. In other words, you have to determine the status of a group as one of statelessness. You have to have, first of all, the legal response of the states. Unless you get the legal response of the states, these persons, and this section of my writing is called in a situation of limbo. This is a situation of legal limbo where law will not tell you anything. UNHCR was telling that yes, we agree that citizenship laws world over have weaknesses, but that does not mean that they are stateless. And by declaring them as stateless, you are in fact impairing the cause of citizenship. And this charge or complaint against us, I would say, is partly true. Partly true in the sense that if you ask the Rohingyas, or if you ask, let us say, the Chakma stateless people who were resettled in the the northeastern part of India which is called the Arunachal Pradesh, and Chakmas had been taken to Arunachal Pradesh in the mid-60s by India after they had been uprooted because of the construction of the Kaptai Dam in Chittagong. If you ask the victims, they will say, we want to be citizens. So citizenship remains a dream for all people who are stripped of citizenship. And if you tell them that you are stateless, they will say, no, we are citizen, our citizenship has been taken away from us. On the other hand, we had been arguing that this is a mirage because you will never give them citizenship. They will always now remain, and by our study we were showing that how they were within these countries remaining for decades and decades without any kind of juridical rights, whether as labor or as citizen or as a recipient of social security and social welfare measures. And our argument was that there cannot be, and this is where I have one thing more and then I shall end. There cannot be any positive definition of statelessness. When you ask who is a refugee, the Convention of 1951 gives you a definition of that X, if one is because of fear or because of violence or fear of violence is driven out, etc., etc., then the person will be considered as refugee. Now, you may say this is okay, the definition of a refugee, but the Refugee Convention tells that only under the condition that the situation is one like that, that you will be considered as a refugee. Now, who is to decide that the situation is one of fear? The court. And this is why we say this is Geneva-based wisdom, because finally the court will decide, and I will give you two instances to show how the whole question of belonging to state or not becomes then a victim of a very positive kind of international law, which will only plays into the hands of powers. In one case, it was argued that violence is normal in your country. So how can you say that it is exceptional and you have fled out of fear? And this was in a case of a Sri Lankan who was seeking asylum in UK. If others are not fleeing and there has been reports of violence because of the civil war in Sri Lanka, then what is exceptional for you that you have fled? How can you say that in your case it was a situation of fear? On the other hand, there have been cases, particularly Canadian legislations, where women, Bangladeshi women, who are being forcibly married with, let us say, a religious cleric or an old landowner of 70 years old, etc., etc., and the woman flees. In that case, the woman will be asked to prove that it was a situation of fear. Things are changing. So Derrida used to call that this is a situation of double jeopardy, in the sense that not only you are fearing something, but you have to also prove that you have feared, and therefore you have a fear and therefore you are fleeing the country. In case of the statelessness, our argument was that if you want to define what is a stateless, can you give a positive definition of what is stateless? Because the positive definition that has been given is Article 1.1. On the other hand, in all the cases or in overwhelming cases of statelessness, it's what you may call the refraction of citizenship, the incompleteness of citizenship. And Etienne Balibar, in one of his fascinating arguments, said that citizenship is something that always incompletes itself. Now, I do not know what the original French term was, but it incompletes itself means it can never complete itself, that it is always something which will be marked by what you might philosophically call a lack. Statelessness is marked by a lack of citizenship rights. a lack of certain social rights, a lack of certain economic rights, etc., etc. You can prove statelessness only by proving certain lack and not by giving a positive definition to what you think to be a stateless condition, which is why we argued with the UNHCR. Why is it that the UNHCR had to follow up the 1954 convention with the 64 convention on reducing statelessness, and by coming up with the idea of de facto statelessness? And de facto statelessness has been a matter of enormous international controversy. Whether this concept is right or not, my own understanding is that there are adequate reasons, but at the same time it shows that de facto is something you can't prove by law. If you are able to prove by law, then you would always say this is de jure. Why do you have to say that this is de facto? So precisely the matter that facts prove, on the other hand you can't prove it by law, shows that this law is inadequate as far as the way citizenship norms are being built. So the final question therefore for me would be, how do you define or how do you understand statelessness? Do you understand statelessness only in connection with forced population movements, which is true, which is agreeable? On the other hand, is there not a ground to argue that statelessness is always the other half of what you might call citizenship? It is citizenship that is always linked to producing this whole idea of the statelessness, and there are very rare historical circumstances where citizenship has been produced without producing statelessness. If that is the case, and if this situation is so bleak, then how do we think of the entire unfolding scenario? And my concluding remarks would be that statelessness, given the fact that it is a kind of a borderland existence, it's a liminal existence. In some cases it will be proved legally, in some other cases it cannot be proved legally. If that is what it is, and if cases where this has been solved at least to a certain extent precisely through the borderland mode of deliberations and settlement, then we have to think of certain kinds of political existences whose model cannot be derived from citizenship, whose models can be derived from only what Foucault would have called the other spaces. Now, is it possible to think of other spaces within the nationalized world of citizenship, where citizenship is based on national modes of existence, where European citizenship also doesn't make sense, which was one great attempt to see if citizenship could be drawn beyond the nationality question? Now, as we know, Jean-Luc Nancy, probably 30 years ago, had raised the question, drawing from Hegel as well as opposing Hegel, who comes after the subject? And the argument was that even though Hegel had derived the whole idea of subject but had opposed it to the whole question of subject, saying that no, there is something beyond that. Is there something in political philosophy to which we can turn and say that there is something more to think beyond the subject? Certain political philosophers answered that after the subject comes the citizen. So citizen is the answer to the subject. All the limits that political philosophy encountered when thinking or when thought was subject centric can be avoided if we think of citizen. In other words, a rights bearing, a claim making, as well as a democratic fabric within which the subject attains citizenship, and therefore citizenship is something subject with certain attributes. We know that Hannah Arendt in some sense had seen the closure of such line of thinking, but yet she too, you can say, fell into a kind of neologism, because when she said that the refugee is a subject of rightlessness, how can you be a subject of rightlessness? If you do not have right, how do you claim subjectivity? What is then the status of your own subject? Now that is where I end with one quotation from Foucault, which will tell the direction or the indication of what I wrote in length. The philosopher Michel Foucault called for thinking of, within quote, other spaces which are beyond the inside-outside beyond our comfort zone that require continuous formation through entering into relations with new forces from the outside. Foucault concluded his essay of other spaces with this rumination, within quote, brothels and colonies are two extreme types of heterotopia, and if we think after all that the boat is a floating piece of space, a place without a place that exists by itself, that is closed in on itself and at the same time is given over to the infinity of the sea, and that from port to port, from tack to tack, from brothel to brothel, it goes as far as the colonies in search of the most precious treasures they conceal in their gardens, you will understand why the boat has not only been for our civilization from the 16th century until the present the greatest instrument of economic development. And I have not been speaking of that today only, but has been simultaneously the greatest reserve of imagination. The ship is the heterotopia par excellence in civilization. Without boats, dreams dry up, espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police takes the place of pirates. To Foucault, the ship was thus the space of such imagination. The ship protected us from an outside which would otherwise swallow us, while at the same time delivering us to outside spaces which together constitute the voyage. In postcolonial state after state, population groups have been hated, ridiculed and deprecated by the nation for having no sense of order, discipline, and national loyalty or roots. Yet, these groups, often interned and expelled by their ambiguous existence, will be now in the forefront of the struggle for practicing the imagination of other spaces, fighting the images of a revenge space. It is in the trait of creating the image of an anarchic space for all that we may call the popular imagination of an other space which will perhaps give the postcolonial nation its symbolic value. Remember, the madman aboard the ship of fools was placed on the inside of an outside as much as he was on the outside of an inside. These liminal spaces will be beyond the spaces of citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranabir, for this detour. Actually, that is, and with a hope at the end that there is the possibility of that kind of an other space, despite the kind of the all the ambiguities and then the despair involved in it, but also a kind of a space for thinking outside of that kind of the citizenship in a way that how it both of them go in combination with all its alterity and with the statelessness, and thinking of statelessness very much connected to citizenship, and also very interesting in terms of that from the very beginning actually the Rohingya, that is, it was very much connected with the economy, with the kind of the labor brought there, and now today again it is very much entangled with those kind of the geopolitics and the kind of the creation of value and then the maritime Silk Roads. But I'm not going to monopolize my role and immediately open the floor for discussion and for questions. Please. Floor, yes.
Well, thank you. Incredibly informative talk. I have a question of clarification, perhaps. If you could say a little bit more about the few cases you mentioned, and most prominently India and Sri Lanka, and the what you call reasonably good solutions to these kind of problems, and maybe if we can think about what a good solution here might look like, and what does it depend on? You mentioned that it very much depends on regional investment, but if you could say maybe a little bit more, just to give us a little context, I think that would be very nice. And just one sort of shoot off your ship metaphor. The ship metaphor is very ancient, at least in the kind of antiquity I know, in Greek thought. And from there we get the metaphor of ship of state. Ship is not only statelessness, but also stateness or community. And I'm wondering why should we accept this idea of Foucault's of anarchic space for all, which seems to call for equality, for equalizing down, right? Let us all become stateless and then we'll be equal, rather than try to equalize up and find a ship for every people.
Would you like to take up immediately? Okay. I mean, if there are other questions that I could... yes, please. Yes.
Your story is connected to the problem of the nation, in fact. So the citizenship, that you have states, and we have nations, and you have nationalism as well. So important in the story, this nationalism. So I wonder, I mean, if you use as a basic concept the idea, I mean, maybe it's a sort of an utopia idea, but existed in the last century so much, of federalism, or looking for a sort of a world federalism. I mean, how can you start redefining your thesis in a different way? Okay. In fact, during the Second World War, there was a rebirth of a federalist idea that was, you know, for the best people, was looking for a new evolution. And in fact, the United Nations are in part the result of this. You know, the United Nations were considered at the beginning as a sort of a better organization of the world vis-à-vis Société des Nations, for this reason, essentially. Then this has been lost somehow, and the nations came back strongly, and so on and so forth. But don't you think that this problem is in fact a problem of, you know, reorganizing the human fabric from a different point of view? Thank you.
Okay. And let me take another one, Luke. And then I'll give you the floor for two.
Thank you very much. That was a very special lecture. My question, well, and I found the discussion around the geo-economic factors behind the Myanmar refugee crisis and Rohingya crisis are absolutely fascinating, and it isn't really brought to life in any of the incredibly traumatic media coverage you have in the West on this question that I've seen. So that was really interesting. On a similar points to Eva, I wanted to push more on this question of why Foucault, and do we really need to abandon, say, Habermas, or abandon the conception of citizenship altogether? So it isn't there a clear solution within the frame of citizenship to have greater pathways to access to citizenship rights? And isn't that offered in some ways in this positivist conception of international law you describe? For social movements and activists around these questions, the demand to be included always seems to be the most important and radicalizing demand. And in some ways that takes the universal frame of citizenship and uses it as a point of mobilization for political struggle. And then lastly, is a post-national citizenship possible? Because I agree also with the colleague here that the questions of nationalism and national ethnic ordering seem to be so important. Oh, I was also, the cases that occurred to me when you were speaking are particularly in Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe in the first half of the 20th century. And there it's not so much the creation of statelessness, but involuntary transfers between states of quote-unquote national citizens. And to come, Greece and Turkey being the classical example. And so not to come to the defense of the Geneva Conventions and so on, I just think that perhaps there was a clear context for how they were approaching the question in the immediate post-war period.
Okay, maybe you just take this first.
Yeah, in the first one, in case of Rohingyas, there is a very clear regional dimension, and one of the maps showed the lines of flight of the Rohingyas. Now, as I said, that if it were in the beginning that the neighboring states had intervened or put pressure on the Myanmar state, probably things would not have been as bad as it is today. Now, it was only in 2015 when, exactly like the Mediterranean deaths, the Bay of Bengal deaths, started attracting attention, and Rohingyas in large number from Cox's Bazar took to the boats, took the help of the Bangladeshis, and it was very difficult to distinguish differentiate between who is a Bangladeshi and who is a Rohingya. And mass graves were found, bodies were found. Indian Navy did commendable work in rescuing some of the ships, recovering bodies, that the question of regional intervention or solution. From 1998-99, there was discussion that some pressure has to be brought on the state of Myanmar. But Australia, time didn't permit me, there is a section on Australia's role which has been horrendous, one of the most lamentable role Australia's. And what Australia has termed as the Pacific solution is not even allowing the boats that finally reached Australia, offshore internment in 2-3 islands. These islands were also taken on lease, exactly like the United States has taken from Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, similarly taken on lease, where Australia used those islands as offshore internment areas. And Tony Abbott, where the height of the crisis, said, nothing doing. If people think that by taking 2 boats, they are coming to Australia, no, it's a regional. So the region, Australia in other cases would say that Australia is included in the Asia-Pacific region. But in this case, Australia said it's a matter of concern for Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. Now, did India and Bangladesh try? No. For Bangladesh, it was partly getting political mileage, partly Bangladesh was also a poor country, helping the Rohingyas as much as possible. And India certainly did not intervene. But India, from 2007-8 to 2015-16, allowed the Rohingyas to stay. Rohingyas have stayed in big number in 2-3 places, in Hyderabad and in Jammu. Jammu is the biggest center of the Rohingya settlement, overwhelming percentage working as informal labor. Now in Southeast Asia you have a process which is called the Bali process, which is aimed at ensuring regional cooperation for stopping trafficking. Malaysia said that let the Bali Convention be invoked to address the Rohingya question, because they said Rohingyas were also being trafficked and there were being deaths on the sea. A correspondent of New York Times brought out an 18-part series. It is one of the fascinating and very important work that a journalist has done this, about how the Pacific had been turned into a sea of deaths or an ocean of deaths, equal in magnitude to the Mediterranean, but there was no concern over the Pacific deaths, but people, Filipino nurses, again Filipino women, boys and girls, and Rohingyas in particular, how they perished on the seas. And the regional solution is a double-edged thing, and with which I shall end. You see, on one hand, who takes to the seas? Even though it's a kind of a rhetorical, query, but when you have taken to the sea on the ship, there is no identity except that you are one on the ship. You cannot say X is a Bangladeshi and Y is a Rohingya. Exactly like you cannot say who is an Algerian, who is a Moroccan, or who is a Nigerian, who is an Ugandan on the ship or the boat that tries to reach the European shore across the Mediterranean. In the ship and on the sea, everyone is stateless. That's the final terra incognita. That's the final place where all national identities will be swamped by the waves. And that can be, if you, in some sense, as I said, a regional solution, in a way where regional countries all try to arrive at some kind of compromise, where you do not have any particular state to offer protection. But on the other hand, you can say, is not Europe trying to achieve the same regional solution by reaching out to the states in the Maghreb region and saying, let us arrive at a Mediterranean solution? So this is you see the point that I am saying, that it's a double-edged thing. Because within the region also there are power games that are playing on. So the kind of role that Australia played in defining what is a region. In the case of Africa, what is interesting is that at the height of decolonization, when still that mood of liberation was on, Africa had this Charter of the African Human Rights and People, which is actually, in some sense, one of the most far-reaching charters of human rights. More than even the Cartagena Declaration, which says that rights of the people in terms of move and rights to claim nationality. Because in Africa, precisely because of the colonial powers, border making and these boundary making exercises, that stateless people were huge in number, the nowhere kind of people. Now, see, the second question is the heart of the whole thing. Equality as citizens or equality as stateless? I will give a very short answer, but I think this will tell you what I am trying to argue. But I know this will not be the answer, meaning that I do not want to stump you with an answer, rhetorical thing. If one were to ask, do you want equality as workers or equality as bourgeoisie? So I know that you are not asking that, but you see what I am trying to say. Endowment is certain things which will always have the kind of difference that I have tried to, place before you. That the world of citizenship is always marked by fault lines. There will be no world of citizenship which will not have the fault lines that I have described. We may say it is particular to Myanmar, but it is not. By a rough figure of 30% of world's refugees are declared stateless, but it could be more. Because de facto stateless we haven't counted at all, the number of the de facto. there are classic stories of US case histories where who is an American, in order to argue out what Foucault would have later on called biopolitics, that the whole question of blood, ancestry, skin, color, identity, all those we think to be irreducibly biological came into play when deciding on nationality, etc., etc. So, of course, it would be very good if everyone is citizen, but precisely my story says that everyone will never be citizen. Can we not have, therefore my argument has been, when I say thinking of other spaces, we had a time when, and this is why I ended with the debate, if the debate is that beyond the purely speculative question of subject, the idea is to have citizen, the citizen who is the ultimate figure of the subject as the rights bearing agency, as someone who would have as frame of reference an entire panoply of constitutional legal rights, responsibility, etc., etc. Now, if it is true that this will always be marked by colonial and post-colonial divisions, globally as well as within countries, is it not the time that we think of, we may say that is not anarchic, but what we would have otherwise called a borderland existence be made the main norm of existence? In other words, in declaring what are the rights that I have or I may have, is it not time that we go beyond the conception of citizenship? That is the point that I am referring to. In other words, how do we ensure, how do we imagine or what can be the political imaginary which can address or which will try to address both the inclusive and the exclusive part of the whole thing? If that is the case, that where citizenship norms, take the Indian Citizenship Act, take the kind of Aliens Act, take the kind of the other Foreigners Act, whereby large number of people are in India, I have not told, 4 million people on the ground of being suspected Bangladeshis. Those who had come to India in 1910, 1912, they have been now asked to produce what is called the legacy papers. The Windrush generation in case of UK. Now, are these exceptional cases or there is a global pattern to what is happening? So, in all these cases, my argument would be that I am not saying that let us do away with citizenship, but we have, I am not saying also that overnight we can do away with the hierarchy in terms of substantive citizenship. But on the other hand, if the Rohingya solution, the way Indians are trying to find is to be the solution, then we are actually accepting that you will eternally have a subclass of laboring people who will never have juridical rights. You will say that, okay, I will not expel you, as Rohingyas had been expelled. Like today, the whole strategy of Bangladeshis, Indians with the patronage of the European and United States is persuade the Myanmaris to take back the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas will go back hypothetically, but they will never be given back the land. Like the Palestinians, even if they go back, will never get back whatever they had. They will never get back their citizenship rights. So they will remain, they will labor, and this is precisely how you will have always a huge subaltern class of labor who will have no political visibility, but who will be the economically visible in society. Now, is that then the way? So we preserve citizenship, but at what cost? So and you were right. I am saying that UN attempted a federal form of political existence, but on the basis of the global realities of nationalization of citizenship in the post-war era. But today, if we are asked what is the federal form of our life, what is the federal form of politics, what is the federal form of existence, then this brings us back to the point that I raised, that how do you address the question of statelessness? Do you address this on the basis of citizenship laws, or do you have to think in terms of other kinds of membership of a political society which will be able to inherit the best of citizenship virtues, but at the same time surmount the problems that citizenship presents for us. And I think this is where my argument is that I am not abandoning citizenship. Citizenship has abandoned me. The onus is on citizenship laws to tell us how those who are non-citizens of the world can be accommodated. The onus is not, because those who are not citizens want to become citizens, but they will never be. This is why I say that I can always try to buy a share in a joint stock firm when I am a worker, because shares are offered. But that will never mean that I shall become a member of that class. That division between the world of rights and rightlessness is becoming much more stark than the time, Hannah Arendt was speaking of. And population transfers have been enormously costly. You may think of a peaceful population transfer. This will be very, very exceptional. Of late, an Italian political historian of Eastern Europe, Stefano Bianchini, has written a book. It is called Liquid Nationalism, Population Transfers and Partitions, or maybe Partitions, I'm forgetting. He teaches at Forlì, Bologna University. And it's a fascinating book which actually tells us the range and the depth and the extent of population transfers that happened in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. He doesn't come up to the 21st century. And if you think of Punjab population transfer, this has been one of the most horrible attempts. It was better that they had remained where they were instead of transferring the mutual segments.
I have Eva, Shalini, you, and then I have myself, and I think we have to close. Eva, please.
Thank you for the very complex presentation. I hope I can make my point. So I want to come back to this refugee labor, which seems to be somehow at the root of the population, which ends up in the 20th century then as stateless population. And so the parallel I have on mind is the Kosovo Roma in Slovenia. And they were among the most, or they are among the most prominent population of the stateless in Slovenia after the disintegration of Yugoslavia. And I'm wondering whether we can say, or whether you can say something about how this whole question of who ends up stateless in the end, or is also tied to a question of which forms of labor migration are legitimate, or which types of labor are allowed to migrate from or to be mobile from one place to the other without ending up stateless. And the background of my question is that in Yugoslavia after the Second World War, you had a very huge mobilization of the whole labor force, mostly also in unpaid labor brigades. And then only eventually when the economy recovered, you had certain concern from the side of the state that now the population was actually being too mobile, because mobility started to translate into being able to negotiate for higher wages. And one of the key problems that Yugoslavia had to battle with during the time of its existence was how to manage the uneven development of the whole territory. So it also had to somehow put into place the workers, and in the beginning of the 50s it introduced the worker self-management, that was one of the main instruments to do that. And this worker self-management obviously institutionalized certain forms of work, but other types of work stayed outside of this worker self-management. And that was types of work that these Kosovo Roma, for example, engaged in, like as street hawkers, or the case that I'm investigating, the waste pickers. So here you have this very strong interconnection between who ended up as stateless and who was engaging in atypical forms of labor during the existence of the regime, which then disintegrated. So.
So, three quick questions. One, I was thinking, rather than think in terms of the binary of state and statelessness, or citizens and non-citizens, don't you think one of the tendencies we see is the unbundling of citizenship rights? That you can have economic rights, but you will not have political rights, which is the case of millions of migrants in the EU who will have in the countries of their residence here economic rights, but also partially some social rights and no political rights. In India, on the other hand, a lot of the people I do field work with all have political rights. If they live in a slum in Bombay or Ahmedabad, they can vote, but they have no economic rights. So citizenship is no longer the old bundle that we were thinking of. It's the unraveling of those rights and the very partial and selective granting of some citizenship rights as against others, which I think is a problem which we need to think of rather than just state and statelessness. I mean, I take your large point on statelessness, but I still think that we have within a country like India so many people who are formally not stateless and yet they enjoy hardly any citizenship rights. They can be internally displaced, they can be internal migrants, they can be people who are just the urban poor, etc. So I think we need to think about that whole question in one sense. The other thing which I found really fascinating in your description of the Rohingya case, which I had not thought of, because I had been thinking of it primarily as a question of one of the points you were making, which is the right territory, the right population. So the right population is very much a question of the purity of the nation. And it's very much about a definition of who belongs, depending on what criteria you use for having a pure, authentic population. The others don't belong. So here you have a logic of purity, because as Indian Muslims, they do not belong. And then you have a very different logic, which is the logic of land and labor in this part. So it's a historical logic, but it's also contemporary logic. So the question here is, how do these two logics intersect? Because were it not for the purity logic, one could say they could be turned into labor for the mining in the area, because apparently what one hears is that the Rakhine state is interesting for the Burmese military, apart from the Indian and the Chinese, is because it has a lot of mineral wealth. And to extract that mineral wealth, you will need labor in any case. So the question is, for that extraction, in a sense, the purity of the ethnic composition of the labor should not be a primary consideration, as long as that labor can be exploited at low wages. And then there is the logic of the purity of the nation state. And so I think it might be interesting to think in terms of how these two different logics interact in your case. My last question is, the Foucault story took me by a surprise in Heterotopia, and I see why you want the metaphor of the ship as the inside and the outside. But the person I was thinking of listening to you was James Scott, because he is looking precisely at this region, making the argument that all of these groups, so he doesn't want to abandon statelessness, he wants to abandon states, right? Because his argument as an anarchist is to say that the problem here is the state, And actually, these are the populations which have managed through centuries to evade the grip of the central state on their lives. And actually, they have lived the kind of lives that they could precisely because they have been able to extricate themselves from the control of the state. So in his utopia, if you like, or in his kind of other space, it would be a space in which these different groups could find a modus vivendi of living with one another and living with nature without the control of the state. But that would be another way of thinking about the whole question of statelessness.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very rich talk, and I also want to draw on something which was said here before or raised by Shalini and other people, which is the question of state and the state building. Just looking very briefly at this map, every political geograph would tell you this is less to do with populations and much more to do with the access to sea, the borders, resources, and basically conquest and control of resources. And so this is one problem: nation and state building. Yeah, so actually states have to secure certain access to resources. So the second, the second comment is more important, because if we all know that quote from Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, that there is a great danger in human rights discourse that they will be proclaimed, but they won't be. Nobody will be able to defend them. And Hannah Arendt goes on to argue in favor of the existence of the state as the only guarantor of your rights. And therefore citizenship is absolutely essential to guarantee your rights, your freedoms, and not necessarily, I like this unbundling the binary of citizenship, non-citizenship, because we have many different regimes of the rights protection. Europe is a very good example of it. And I think there was a wonderful paradox in your talk. On one hand, the question of legal regulation is who is and how is it going to be protected? The populations, right deprivations, discrimination, and deportations, and so on and so on. And we have, if we don't have the state and international order, if we go beyond statehood, if we go into this political imaginary of statelessness, what agency will take care of those stateless peoples? Thank you.
Oh, you had a question too? Okay. Do you have a question? No? Oh, okay, okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. My question also follows very much from this one, that for some of the questions, in terms of when I was saying that the kind of the statelessness, in a way, kind of the alternative of citizenship, that there will be always this kind of lack, so that it is bound, in a way, this kind of the binary. But on the other hand, if we would like to think of this kind of the open space that you were talking about, and try to put our hopes in it, in a way, as a kind of an anarchic space, then the question becomes what's actually what I was trying to, what is not clear to me is that you said that we have to think about a different kind of a modus of membership. We have to think of a different kind of access for the rights and the agencies that will guarantee the right. So if we take the state out, because within if we are taking it the citizenship in a way out, and what would be the kind of solutions, quote unquote, solutions that you were referring to, kind of the regional, but these are all kind of incomplete solutions. So where would it be anchored, that kind of the membership and the four kinds of rights? Okay. So I give you the floor for all these questions.
No, these are very important questions. The first question is that yes, refugee labor, what we term as refugee labor, or if it is a, let's say, figure of disenfranchised labor, a labor which would not have political rights and would not have, the kind of rights which then Marshall had talked of, social citizenship, etc. I think you are right that that is at the heart of what I am arguing. It actually brings back, first of all, the classic case of what you may term figuratively a refugee labor would be sex and entertainment workers. There is this EU study which shows that 70% of Europe's sex and entertainment workers, they have clubbed it together, are illegal. So first of all, when we speak of refugee labor or immigrant labor, we have to understand that a large chunk of it is below law, below the legal terrain. It is submerged. And the study that was done, it was contracted to an agency, 70%, it's a huge number, whatever number that is they conducted. And they showed that the immigration rules and all other rules that a state requires, precisely these are the rules, in spite of declaring the work as labor that supposedly should have all the labor protection, etc., that in this case it is not. And UNHCR has today come to acknowledge that trafficking and sex labor is one of the important sources of statelessness. Many other kinds of labor, people who are employed in labor would be able, hypothetically at least, to go back in a metaphorical sense. But the women or men or children employed in sex labor, it has been shown that very few of them would be able to go back. And they are the classic stateless subjects. There have been studies of Nepalis who were trafficked in the brothels of Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And again, it has been seen that while they could be returned in certain cases to Nepal, but apart from the fact that villages or cities or towns would not be able to, would not be accepting them back, which is a different thing altogether, they cannot be returned also. So it is very good, and I appreciate when you say that it is the production of what has been called as refugee labor is at the heart of this thing, that we are, in fact, in some sense, I am thinking of Federici's work on the whole thing of Caliban and the witch, where she is in fact arguing following Marx, that indeed it's a constant process of what she actually borrows from Marx and says outlaw labor. It's a labor that is outlawed. How is it that such labor will be continuously produced? And again, it is very good that you mentioned the question of waste disposal, because it has been found that practically, apart from the sex and entertainment work, it is in waste disposal, in the logistical industries, that you have such kind of labor. We indeed had a study, and Flavia Agnes study on the Bombay bar dancers. Again, when there was the first thing that happened was that the women had nowhere to go back to. Many of them were bundled off into the railway wagons, sent to West Bengal on the ground that they were Bangladeshis. West Bengal refused to say that they were, but the good thing that was done when they came through Howrah, the wagons were opened and the women escaped. So in any case, what I am suggesting is that what Marx had called the reserve army of labor, what I am suggesting, this is one more way today's global reserve army of labor is emerging. And it is important to see actually how far citizenship rights are relevant to this world at all. My own understanding is that the relevance is overblown, and in this world the citizenship rights actually it's something else that we have to go into. But this brings me to a point which Shalini and many others have raised, which I think is very important, which is that once we think that this constitutes the heart of the question, then this is a huge subclass of people, a subpopulation, which will be working as labor with different degrees of welfare measures, protection measures, rights, etc. But by and large, we can say that political visibility will be less or almost nil. So you have here a constant play between economic visibility and political invisibility. The problem of statelessness is so embarrassing and so uncomfortable for global governance is precisely because statelessness does not bring to before the managers of global governance the question of labor, but it brings in the question of labor as the juridical subject of right. Who is this labor who would not have any right? How do we accept, how would liberal democracy accept the fact that while we acknowledge such and such as the bearer of labor, bearer of living labor, yet he or she would not be given or cannot be given the right? We will always say that, well, we have to redefine citizenship, we have to improve citizenship norms, etc., etc. But it's always an uncomfortable thing that this laborer will not be a bearer of any right. In other words, the idea that a laborer becomes a worker through contracting of certain rights, through entering into a freely arrived at contract. Nobody has forced me to be X and Y worker but that I have volunteered, that it's my own choice. Therefore, I have certain rights, certain obligations, precisely the wage norms and other norms, that this will not be there. And exactly if we think of the Rohingyas, whether in the Cox's Bazar area, but much more important when they go back. Actually, that is where the studies are showing, or the Rohingyas who arrived in Malaysia, in Thailand and Malaysia, these are the, I think, waste disposal. And I think, Shalini, actually you point out to a very important thing. All I am suggesting is, I am not saying, yes, I am saying that stateless is the other of citizenship, but what I am suggesting is that you have to link it with citizenship, and it's a kind of a spectrum where one end is, you might say, the stateless, the other is a fully endowed and fully politically enabled agency or a bearer of rights whom we call the citizen, and between them you have different positions. Which is why I said that the way in which statelessness is defined as a kind of a condition which has certain positive definition is not the way to approach statelessness. That's not the way we can address the question. So it is precisely those degrees of lacking in or being endowed with. So in my case, I said it is the lack and the degrees of lack that we have to address. It is not how much we have, but how much we do not have. It's not, that's why I say I do not want to dispense with citizenship, but the citizenship norms dispense with me. So that is where we have to, it is a question of addressing a lack. That is the, the thing. And I think the James Scott question is, you see, it's not a question of seeing like a state, meaning, but James Scott's, finally when he arrives at the whole thing, that if you see like a state, then these kinds of existences are not possible. But what I am saying is that when China moves in, or the global forces moves in, or US determines this attitude to Myanmar depending on precisely the minerals, etc., all those kinds of things, then we find that these people, some of the things that were local will not remain local anymore. The possibility of even negotiating them or addressing them at that stage will not remain. Now, it is here where my understanding is that with globalization, and I do not want to use the word post-national, but certainly with globalization and the way population politics, the reason for alluding to Foucault is precisely because one of the insights that one gets is, how do we go beyond, without saying beyond the development that has already arrived? We cannot gainsay that the developments that are taking place. So whether it is the Gwadar port, or it is the Sitwe, or let us say Idomeni, or Calais, there will be France, there will be UK, there will be EU, so we cannot wish away any of these things. So in other words, there must be an element of struggle, an element of standing against certain things that are happening, because that is based on the recognition that these are happening. We cannot wish against that. So how do we then, how do we go beyond it? And it's not to say that citizenship is unnecessary. No, but can we arrive at certain modes, or political modes, I am not saying in a very metaphysical way, where some kind of solutions can be arrived, which can be obviously cannot be thought of within citizenship norm. Because then we have to demand always, all those people would have to be given back citizenship. States will say we shall never give them citizenship. And UNHCR would have to take upon itself the responsibility of, as we call the mandate refugees, like refugees who are not protected or given refugeehood by any state are given mandate status by UNHCR. What happens with stateless? So unless the Myanmaris are going to take them back, what will happen to the million Rohingyas? Or, that is where I think a more general question emerges, apart from an interim solution like the regional one. The regional one is only an interim, better than nothing. If India can do something, put pressure, etc., etc. But if it is not a purely isolated thing that is happening, if it is happening on a global scale, then I think the question of non-nationalized forms of existence I don't have any other. Yeah, I can't answer also. It's not that helps.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ranabir. Thanks a lot.